Welcome to the Advertising Forum. We're kicking off the new year with our new privacy series, brought to you by Mozilla.
In our first episode, we spoke with Eric Seufert about privacy challenges in the mobile advertising industry. Today, we have Maneesha Mithal, partner at Wilson Sonsini Goodrich Rosati, who will provide a policy point of view on privacy. Maneesha, excited to have you here. Welcome to the Advertising Forum.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Maneesha, as we chatted about you prior to recording, you obviously come with 20 years plus experience at the FTC. As someone with a background at the FTC, how do you see privacy regulations evolving, and what role should businesses and technology providers like Mozilla play in shaping these developments?
Yeah, so I think this is a really opportune time to be talking about this issue. We're at the turn of an administration at the federal level. We have 8 state privacy laws going into effect. And so when it comes to privacy and ad tech regulation, I think there are 3 things that I'm watching. The first is in 2022, the FTC had put out a proposed rule on commercial surveillance that would have regulated ad tech. And we've been watching to see what happens and what the next steps are in that rule. But I think that it's safe to say that with the change in administration, that rulemaking is likely dead. We have a new chair, Andrew Ferguson, coming in. He wants to take a light touch regulation. He believes the FTC has gone too far in creating new regulations. And so I would expect that he would not pursue that rulemaking. So I think that's the first big change that we're seeing at the federal level on privacy. Number 2, I think we're all watching what's going to happen with federal privacy legislation. I think, as you mentioned at the outset, I've been involved in this area for over 20 years. And every year we say, aha, this is the year that there's going to be federal privacy legislation. But no such luck so far. But I think that in 2025, given that we have Republican control of both Congress and the White House, I think that's really the best chance of federal privacy legislation. I think that the united government is one kind of way in which we might be able to get this done. There was a lot of divisions among Republicans and Democrats, and we'll see if it's able to get done. I think industry supports the federal privacy law in general. I think some factors cutting against the possibility of federal privacy legislation is that if Republicans decide to have a watered down regulation, I think there'll be a lot of pushback among advocacy groups, Democrats, and it also just remains to be seen whether it'll be a priority. So that's kind of the second area of focus. Third is the states. So I think by 2026, about half of the U.S. population will be covered by state privacy laws. We'll see 8 going into effect. So it's something that businesses will have to watch for regardless of whether there's federal privacy legislation. And then finally, I think in terms of your question about what businesses can do, I think that Mozilla in particular has been viewed by regulators as an honest broker. So advocating for industry points of view, but at the same time taking a very pro-privacy, pro-building consumer trust point of view. And so I think that companies can continue to take that role and not take extreme positions. I think they'll be well positioned to shape the future of privacy regulation.
You mentioned the strategies behind what businesses should do as privacy policies change and regulation changes. What are some tools that businesses could utilize to help build trust while keeping your advertising effective?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things I would recommend. One is to be particularly careful with sensitive data. I think a lot of the headlines we see involve the collection and sharing of health data, precise geolocation information. And if you look at the FTC privacy cases over the last year, those are 2 areas that it's focused on very much. And so one kind of example and takeaway is that the FTC has looked at certain health apps that share information with the large ad tech companies. And instead of naming the events with neutral names, event number 1 or event number 2, some of these health apps have named their events for share with ad tech providers. They've named the events miscarriage or trying to conceive. And so I think those are the types of things that companies can do when they're building their systems, working with engineers to try to figure out how to share the least amount of sensitive data possible while still enabling ads on their site. Maybe they're contextual ads. Maybe they are not providing as much sensitive information. I think companies can also be sensitive to what's happening in the news. I think post-Dobbs, we saw a lot of companies come out and say that they're not going to retain location information for long periods of time. So I think that's something that companies can do. And I think the last area that regulators are really focused on is kids and teens. And so I think things like setting default settings to share less information for teens, I think those are the types of things that regulators are looking at. So I think sensitive information is really what creates the bad headlines for ad tech. And I think if ad tech companies are just sensitive to how they address these issues, kids, teens, location, health, I think that would go a long way to building trust.
From your perspective, how does Mozilla align with the broader industry trends towards privacy-first advertising? And what makes their approach stand out compared to others in the market?
Yeah, so I think two things. The first is that in terms of its advocacy and its public, both government relations and public relations, I think Mozilla has been a market leader in prioritizing privacy and putting privacy first. And so just from its principles on privacy and AI, to its kind of advocacy for rulemaking and federal privacy legislation, I think it's been a market leader. But at the same time, it's not been one of those companies that is just kind of touting privacy values. It's also putting its money where its mouth is. So in terms of the browser controls, in terms of privacy controls, things like preventing browser fingerprinting by default, I think those are the types of initiatives that regulators really see. And it really is, it does influence them when companies are voluntarily putting these mechanisms in place and trying to establish themselves as market leaders on privacy. And I think Mozilla has really done that from the beginning.
So Maneesha, what are the biggest challenges that you see for brands and agencies when adopting these privacy-preserving technologies?
Yeah, so I think that one challenge, and right now, I was a regulator for over 20 years. Now I represent companies. And so I get a lot of clients asking me, hey, we want to do the right thing, but we're concerned about our competitors. And so I think the concern is that if companies are behaving in privacy first ways, they are going to lose market share to their competitors. And I think one of the solutions for that is to pass federal privacy legislation, set an even playing field, make sure that all companies have to comply with the same rules. And I think that that's a solution to that problem. But I do think that consumers now are demanding privacy and companies are competing on privacy. And so whenever my clients say to me, I'm concerned about losing market share, my response is, you're going to lose market share if you don't get on the bandwagon and you have these bad news articles that come out about how you've overshared information or how you're targeting people based on sensitive information. So I think that's one challenge. I think another challenge that companies also often come to me with is, hey, we want to implement these privacy enhancing technologies. We want to work with vendors on privacy enhancing technologies, but we're concerned, what if we make a mistake? What if there's a foot fault, or what if there's a problem? And so I think a couple of solutions there. One is to make sure to have robust internal governance processes. So if you're using vendors to enhance privacy, make sure you're doing due diligence. Make sure you're validating what vendors are telling you, both from a policy level as well from a technology level. Make sure you're running tabletops and conducting risk assessments internally as to what could go wrong, what would happen if something went wrong, how can we respond to things. And so I think that's something that regulators would look well on. We had a client who did run into the situation, and they were investigated by the FTC. And what we were able to show the FTC is we had robust risk assessment, we had robust processes in place, we tested out the technology, and the FTC actually closed the investigation. So I think showing that you have these governance procedures in place is really helpful. And I think the second solution is advocacy with regulators. So not waiting until there's a problem, but advocacy with regulators. I think things like regulatory sandboxes, safe harbors. If you look at, for example, Colorado AI regulation, they've established some affirmative defenses if you comply with NIST, for example. And so I think just talking to regulators about this issue and making sure that they understand, so that the first kind of problem is not the subject of a regulatory action, you can persuade them that you've put in place governance procedures.
So the solutions and themes that you just talked through had a lot to do with collaboration. That was, as I was listening, that was the key word that was coming up in between these two ears. What are your best recommendations on how legal experts like yourself, technology providers, and businesses can actually accelerate the transition to a privacy-first internet while ensuring that both compliance and innovation are taking place?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. Collaboration is key. And I think it manifests that way, itself in a couple of ways. First, I think that it's great for companies to have workshops, public forums, conferences, maybe even kind of private events. And I've been to some of these where you really just roll up your sleeves, you share best practices, you benchmark. And a lot of these sometimes are under Chatham House rules where it's not public. You're not kind of taking things public, but you're talking amongst yourselves, not in a way that's violating antitrust law by like setting standards, but in a way that you're really just benchmarking best practices on how to protect consumers, how to build trust, and how to promote privacy. I think the other piece is advocacy through trade associations in Washington. And I think we've seen lots of great examples of that. So one example is the ADPPA. So if you look at privacy legislation, I think there's long been consensus about the need for privacy legislation. I think the sticking points were A, the extent to which federal privacy legislation would preempt state laws, and B, the extent to which there would be a private right of action where class action attorneys could sue under a federal law. And I think you had trade associations do advocacy and say, hey, we really want this federal privacy legislation. And so a deal was brokered between Republicans and Democrats that essentially had preemption of state laws and a very limited private right of action. And so I think that's an example of how trade associations and others can really go to their members of Congress and really advocate for, this is the finish line. How can we get there? And really have these kind of convenings behind closed doors. So I think that's another avenue for collaboration is through trade associations. And, I just think collaboration is key. And even within an organization, I would say having multi-stakeholder groups, lawyers, engineers, marketing professionals, government relations professionals. I think having that within an organization is really important.
Maneesha, this has been awesome. This has been such a great conversation. On behalf of ATG and myself, thank you. Thank you for this lively discussion. Thank you for being our guest. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge on all things regulation within our space. On privacy, thank you to our series sponsor, Mozilla. ATG to you.
Yeah, thank you, Maneesha, for being here. And again, thank you to Mozilla for sponsoring our privacy series. See you guys on the next episode.
Thanks for having me, guys. This has been great.
Thank you.